Plain, the Duke of Thirlwood said, and set down his pen as though the word settled the matter. Plain, sensible and quiet. I have no use for beauty, and less for cleverness that fancies itself charm. Find me a woman who will sign the register, run the household, and trouble me as little as a well-kept clock. His solicitor, a careful man named Pell, did not look up from his papers. The entail allows you until Michaelmas next, your grace. After that, the estate passes to your cousin and his appetites. Then I shall not give it to him. Magnus rose and crossed to the tall window of his study, where the autumn fields of Thirlwood lay grey and folded under a low sky. He had buried his pride in this house already. He could bury a little more. A bargain, Pell, nothing softer. I want a bride who understands that and asks for nothing it cannot deliver. So the search was conducted as one might select a steward, by reputation, by report, by the cold accounting of who could be had. There were beauties paraded that season, daughters of ambitious mothers, girls with bright laughs and brighter expectations. Magnus dismissed every one of them. He did not want to be charmed. He had been charmed once, long before, by a woman who had laughed at his stiffness and married a man with a lighter temper, and he had decided in the aftermath that warmth was a thing other men could afford and he could not. It was Pell who brought him the name of Jacintha Order. A gentlewoman of no fortune, your grace, 28, considered plain, sensible by every account, well-read in a quiet way, manages her ailing father's small house and his temper besides. Overlooked at 3 seasons and resigned to it. She would, I think, suit your requirements precisely. Overlooked, Magnus repeated. Good. An overlooked woman knows the worth of a roof and a name. Bring her. They were introduced in his drawing room on a cold morning, and the Duke understood at once why she had been called plain. She was not striking. Her features were even but unremarkable, her gown several years out of fashion, and carefully mended at the cuff, her brown hair drawn back without ornament. She curtsied without flutter and met his eye without coyness, and the Duke approved of all of it the way he approved of a sound horse. Miss Ord, you have been told the nature of my situation. I have, your grace. Her voice was low and steady. You require a wife and an heir within the year, and you have chosen me because I am unlikely to expect more than the situation contains. He had not heard it stated so plainly by anyone but himself, and it gave him a small, surprised pause. You are blunt. You have not invited me here to be flattered. It would waste your morning and mine. She folded her hands. I will tell you what I expect, since you will only mistrust a woman who pretends to expect nothing. I expect to be treated with courtesy. I expect a household I may keep with dignity. I do not expect love, and I will not punish you for failing to provide it. Beyond that, I am, as you were promised, sensible. The Duke regarded her for a long moment. He had braced himself for tears, or scheming, or the brittle gaiety of a woman pretending the bargain was a romance. He had not braced himself to be answered like an equal across a table of business. And what do you gain, Miss Ord, that you should agree to so cold a thing? A future, she said simply. My father will not live many years. When he is gone I shall have nothing and no one. You offer me a place in the world. That is not nothing, your grace. I have learned not to despise it. There were details to be settled before the wedding, and the Duke settled them with the cool dispatch of a man closing accounts. A settlement was drawn for her, generous, he told himself, because generosity cost him nothing and bought a clear conscience. He met her father once, a querulous invalid who looked at the great Duke marrying his overlooked daughter with the bewildered suspicion of a man waiting for the trick to reveal itself, and Jacintha managed the old man through the interview with a deftness Magnus noted without yet admiring, soothing, redirecting, sparing them all the worst of his temper, without once seeming to labour at it. It was a small thing, The Duke filed it away among the other small things, and did not yet understand that they were accumulating into something he had no defense against. They were married 3 weeks later in the small grey church on his land, with Pell and the housekeeper as the only witnesses worth the name. Jacintha wore a gown the colour of dove's wings, and when the Duke slid the wedding band onto her finger his hand was perfectly steady, because there was nothing in him that day to make it tremble. She said her vows clearly. He said his. They drove back to the house through the bare November lanes in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised him, for he had expected to find her dull. Once, when the carriage lurched on a rut and her shoulder met his, neither of them moved apart with any particular haste, and the Duke looked out of the window at the grey fields and was aware of a warmth at his side that he chose, for the present, to examine. That first night, in the great cold house, he came to her door and stood a moment with his hand on the wood, and when at last he went in there was a fire lit, and the curtains drawn against the dark, and she met him without fear and without pretence, as she met everything. What passed between them belonged to no one but themselves, and the candle was put out, and the Duke, who had married a stranger for the sake of an entail, lay afterward in the dark beside his quiet wife and found, to his great unease, that he did not wish to be anywhere else. He told himself it was the natural ease of a thing well begun. He did not yet have the courage to call it by its true name. He did not find her dull. It began with small things, as such things do. He came down to breakfast on the third morning to find the cold formal room rearranged, his chair turned a quarter toward the window, so the morning light fell on his newspaper instead of behind it. He had complained of nothing. She had simply noticed, the way one notices weather. He said nothing either, but he read his paper in the light and was aware of it. He found that the house, which had been run with grim efficiency since his mother's death, had begun to run with something else underneath the efficiency, a warmth he could not name and did not credit at first. Fires were lit in rooms before he entered them. The library, which he had let go cold and disordered for years, was set right one slow shelf at a time, and he discovered her there one evening on a low stool with a leather-bound volume open across her knees, frowning at it with such absorption that she did not hear him come in. "You read Marcus Aurelius," he said. She started and rose. "I read whatever your shelves contain, your grace. I hope I do not presume." "It is your house. Read what you like." He came closer and looked at the worn spine in her hands, and at the small line of concentration between her brows that he had not noticed before, because he had not troubled to look. "What do you make of him?" "That he was a sad man trying very hard to be a good one," she said, "and that trying counts for a great deal." She glanced up at him, and there was something in her plain face, when she was thinking that was not plain at all. "I have always thought it is easy to be good when one is happy. The men worth admiring are the ones who manage it cold." The Duke went to bed that night and lay awake a long while, and could not have said why. The year turned toward winter. He began, almost against his will, to seek her conversation. She did not chatter, which he had feared. She spoke when she had something to say and was content to be silent otherwise, and he found that her silences were companionable rather than empty, that sitting across the firelit hearth from her, with their separate books, was a thing he came to look forward to without admitting it. She had opinions dryly held and dryly delivered, and a way of saying something quietly devastating about a pompous neighbour that made him laugh aloud one evening, actually laugh, a sound rusty from disuse, and then look at her in something like alarm, as though she had picked a lock he had thought sealed. There was, too, a dinner that winter, one of the rare occasions on which Thirlwood opened its doors to its neighbours, and the Duke watched his wife from the head of the table with a slow-dawning astonishment. The county had come prepared to pity her, or to sneer, having heard how the cold Duke had bought himself a plain nobody to satisfy his lawyers. They did not sneer for long. She did not dazzle them, for she had no gift for dazzling. She simply attended to each of them in turn, drew out the shy curate on his bees, set the formidable Lady Marsden laughing over some dry observation, soothed a quarrel between two pompous squires before it could spoil the soup, and by the time the cloth was drawn she had the whole table eating from her hand, without one of them quite knowing how it had been done. Magnus, who had been feared and obeyed at his own table for 15 years and never once loved at it, sat watching the woman he had chosen for being unremarkable make herself the warm centre of his cold house, and felt something in his chest he had no name for and no wish, suddenly, to be rid of. "You laughed," she observed. "I am told it happens on occasion." "Not often, by the look of the surprise on your face." But she was smiling, a small contained smile, and the firelight was kind to her, and the Duke realized with a slow internal lurch that he no longer thought her plain at all. He thought her face the most interesting in any room, because it was the only one he wished to watch change. He did not know what to do with the realization, so he did nothing, which was his habit with feeling, but he watched her more. He watched her with the tenants, who had been wary of the Duke's cold bargain of a wife, and who came, within a season, to seek her out, the way she sat with a sick old woman without hurry, the way she remembered the names of children and the troubles of households, the way warmth came off her not as performance but as plain honest weather, the way the morning light he had once moved his chair into. He had married a clock, by his own design. He had got instead a hearth, and he had been cold so long that he had not known the difference until he stood in front of it and felt himself thaw. It was a hard frost in the new year that showed him plainly what he had been refusing to see. A fever ran through the village, and Jacintha, against the cautions of the housekeeper, went down among the cottages day after day with broth and blankets and a steady undramatic presence, until at last she caught the thing herself, and was 3 days abed with a fever that turned, on the second night, dangerously high. The Duke, who had told himself he had married a convenience, found that he could not leave her sick room. He sat through the dark hours in a hard chair beside her bed while she tossed and murmured, and he held the cool cloth to her brow himself rather than yield it to a servant, and somewhere in that long cold night he understood that if the fever took her, he would not be losing a clock or a bargain or a means to satisfy an entail. He would be losing the only person who had ever made his great house feel like anything but a tomb. When the fever broke toward dawn and her eyes opened clear and found him there, disheveled and grey with sleeplessness in the chair he had not left, she looked at him a long moment and said only, "You stayed," in a voice of such quiet wonder that he had to turn his face away. "Of course I stayed," he said roughly, and could not have explained, then, why his voice would not hold. The change in him frightened him, because it gave the Entail's bargain a power over his happiness that he had specifically married to avoid. If she were only a duty, he could not lose her. If she were dear to him, he could, and the long night by her sickbed had shown him, past all denying, exactly how much there was now to lose. He grew for a few weeks, colder again, retreating into formality, dining apart, answering her in short words. And Jacintha, who missed nothing, watched him do it and said nothing for a time, until one evening she came into the library where he sat pretending to read, and she shut the door, and she stood before the fire with her steady eyes on him. "You are unhappy," she said. "I had thought, lately, that you were less so. I find I do not like to see it return, and I find I have grown bold enough to ask why." "I am perfectly content, madam." "You are not, and you are a poor liar for a man so practised at hiding things." She came a step nearer. The firelight moved on her face. "I made you a promise when we began that I would not punish you for failing to love me. I have kept it. But I did not promise not to mind, Magnus, and I find that I do mind, that I have come to mind a great deal, and so I will ask you once, plainly, as we have always dealt with each other plainly, have I done something to make myself disagreeable to you? For I would mend it if I could." He stood. The leather-bound book slid from his knee unregarded to the floor. He looked at her, at the plain dear face he had chosen, because he thought it could not move him, at the steady eyes that had read him as easily as Marcus Aurelius, at the small mended cuff of the gown she still wore though he could buy her 50, and the cold thing he had built around himself for a decade simply gave way. "You have done nothing disagreeable," he said, and his voice was not steady at all now, not in the least. "You have done the one thing I forbade. I asked for a bargain. I asked for a clock, and you have made me—" He stopped. He had not said the word in years and was unpracticed at it. "You have made me happy, Jacintha, and I have been a coward about it, because a man cannot lose a bargain, but he can lose a wife he loves, and I find that I love mine, and the fear of it has made me wretched." She went very still. Then her steady composure broke into something he had never seen on her, a brightness, a wholeness, her plain face transfigured by it into beauty he would have sworn before any court in England. "You great cold fool," she said unsteadily. "Did you imagine you loved alone? I have loved you since the morning you turned your chair into the light and pretended you had not noticed. I have loved you and held my tongue, because I gave you my word I would expect nothing, and I have nearly perished of the keeping of it." He crossed the space between them and took her hands, the right one, where the wedding band sat that he had given her without a tremor, and would never again be able to look at without one, and he raised them to his lips, and then he drew her into his arms before the fire, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left that needed saying, and a great deal that did not need words at all. The Entail was satisfied, in its time as entails are, but that was the least of what came of it, and they both knew it. It was a season later, on a soft spring evening, that she found him standing at the nursery window with the firelight behind him, looking out at the green fields of Thirlwood with an expression she had never seen on his guarded face, open, undefended, almost young. She came and stood beside him and slipped her hand into his, and he closed his cold fingers warm around it. "I went looking for the plainest, most sensible woman in England," he said quietly, watching the light fade over his land, "to keep myself safe from exactly this. I have never in my life been so glad to have failed at anything." "You did not fail," Jacintha said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You merely got more than you bargained for. Most fortunate men do." And the Duke of Thirlwood, who had married for duty and been ambushed by love, looked down at the steady warm woman the world had overlooked, and he had nearly overlooked too, and thought that of all the cold calculations of his careful life, this was the one mercy he had never deserved, would spend the rest of his days giving thanks for.